and the audience watching it are descended from those slaves who once worked on the plantation. We're joined today with the descendants of the owners of Somerset Place to celebrate a shared history. Until recently, bitter memories of slavery would have made such a reunion impossible in America's South. But attitudes are changing, and it's archaeology that is helping to change them.
People of my generation, both black and white, just want to know more about the past. We know that it wasn't great and there were a lot of problems, but we like to know just how the slavery, what was involved in the slavery experience. And the scholarship is showing that there's a great deal to be proud of, that Afro-Americans did create a culture and traditions that are significant, and they're still with us today.
This world is not my home. I'm a stranger here, and my home and all of my treasures, they are all held up on high. Walk on.
Middleburg Plantation, near Charleston, South Carolina. 150 years ago, these fields helped supply half of America's rice. They're now abandoned. The land has reverted to swamp. The men and women who once toiled in the rice fields and who built the plantation houses above them were slaves, kidnapped from Africa and forced to work for harsh masters in the New World. Now the land which they cleared and made fertile is being disturbed once more by a team of archaeologists from the University of South Carolina.
The slave houses that were here were torn down and rotted down in the 19th century, and they're gone, but the archaeological remains of those houses are still here. We can dig down a few inches below the surface of the ground and find the remains of those houses and the remains of the activities that slaves carried out in and around their houses, just where they left them. It hasn't been disturbed by people bringing in large tractors and turning it over, or by erosion, or by development, and so forth.
It's the third year of excavations at the Middleburg site. Slaves owned few possessions. But for the archaeologists working here, success is not measured by the discovery of exquisite artifacts. Their aim is to unearth new information about a neglected community.
Planters were interested, for the most part, in the work that slaves could do. And so that's the kind of information that we have about slaves. We have very little information about their everyday lives. Archaeology can provide that. The historical documents don't provide it, but here, as we begin to do archaeological work in a slave village, we go into the houses like we're doing right back here. And from that, we can begin to find out information about their everyday activities.
Between the 16th and the mid-19th centuries, some 10 million Africans were transported to the New World. Shackled together in the darkness and stench of a ship's hold, untold numbers died of disease and malnourishment. Others committed suicide by leaping overboard. In America, those who survived the journey were auctioned off at huge slave markets. On some plantations, overseers could prove relatively humane. But on others, brutality was commonplace. Many slaves were subjected to horrific punishments. When the English first settled permanently in South Carolina after 1670, they owned few slaves. But Africans were to be imported in huge numbers, and soon there were 10 blacks to every white. The English settlers found the South Carolina wilderness hostile. The heat was intense, the humidity oppressive. The many swamps provided a fertile breeding ground for fever-carrying mosquitoes. Africans, however, were used to this sort of climate and resistant to disease. And as rice became the staple crop here, their experience of its cultivation in West Africa was to prove invaluable. Through their expertise and hard labor, slaves made the swamplands fertile and their masters the richest men in the colonies. With good reason was the rice they grew called Carolina gold. Over the past 5 years, Richard Schultz, a successful eye surgeon, has reintroduced Carolina gold on his plantation. Though he uses modern machinery, the work has given him a new respect for his slave predecessors.
You know, that's one of the things that the people used to have to contend with a couple of hundred years ago, too. They had all those birds in attacking the rice, and they had to do the same thing we did, and that is just stand there and yell at them and wish they'd go away, and no, they won't. They used to shoot them then.
They used the shotgun to shoot at them.
Yeah.
Scare
them. It's hard work. The rice is abrasive to your hands, which is something we had no idea. Just standing in the muddy fields is difficult. The heat is terrible. Insects, snakes. It's just very, very unpleasant work. Sounds romantic, but in the event, it's not romantic at all, and it would be very, very difficult labor.
Dick and Julius harvested this rice by hand last year,
and
it was
I
quite a lot
wouldn't
of
want
work.
to. As a matter of fact, Julius, I think that we never kept up more than an hour, and we'd quit.
Oh, it was too
You
hot.
know, too hot, too miserable, too difficult. After 60 minutes, that's about as much fun as you can stand.
In this rare footage, shot in South Carolina in 1940, a line of black workers cultivates rice in the traditional way. Though filmed in the 20th century, these images would have been familiar to 18th century slaves. The techniques seen here have their roots in the rice fields of West Africa. On the Cooper River by Middleburg Plantation, reeds have long since replaced rice. But Leland Ferguson can still find evidence of the scale of slave achievements here.
This is a break in one of the rice banks on Middleburg Plantation. We know that this bank was finished by 1786 because we have it outlined on a map that dates from that year. These banks were built by black Africans who came to South Carolina as pioneers. On Middleburg, there's probably about 2 to 3 miles of rice banks, and these were all built by hand by slaves in the 18th century who were working out here in the marsh, in the mud, using hoes and shovels and baskets to lift soil up out of the marsh and into the bank so that they could clear and drain these fields. Incredibly, within about 50 years from when they began, they had completed most of the rice banks that we see on this portion of the Cooper River. These rice banks on Middleburg stood about 8 feet tall, about 15 feet wide at the base, and about 5 feet at the top. We've measured all the rice banks on this short 12.5-mile stretch of river on the east branch of the Cooper River, and there are more than 55 miles of banks here. That's about 6 million cubic feet of earth. And that rivals the largest earthworks in in North America, if we were to total all the volume of the rice banks around the rice fields in the low country of South Carolina and Georgia, they would rival the largest hand-built earthworks in the world. It would be comparable to the pyramids in Central America and to the pyramids in Egypt.
With the end of slavery, rice cultivation at Middleburg collapsed. The old steam-powered rice mill, revolutionary technology when it was installed in the 1820s, is still here, slowly rusting in the humid heat. The main plantation house at Middleburg is now being restored by its present owner. Built around 1697, it's the oldest wood-framed house in South Carolina. Nearby stand a 19th century stable and another structure held by tradition to be a slave prison. It's around and under these two buildings that the remains of the 18th century slave quarters lie. Simple houses leave few traces, and Leland Ferguson's skill is in teasing out the evidence from artifact fragments and soil colors.
Here we see one of the foundation posts for a building that was the first in a line of houses in this village that slaves lived in here at Middleburg. We're at the foundation level below the old ground surface, and you can see the post mold here is darker, and the hole is this orange area outside. There's another one of these posts to this same house just up here. You see the larger outline that has orange in it is the post hole. It's rectangular, it's probably dug with a shovel. And then inside that, this brown stain is the mold of the post that was set upright in the ground here and then rotted away, and the debris from it and soil from up on the living surface fell down in and caused this dark stain. Now, there's another post in this line just in front of me. Again, you can see the outline of the post hole, the post at the foundation level, sitting upright, and then here we've left a remnant of the old ground surface. This is the surface that people were actually living on when they were using this house. And it's darker than this soil because people were dropping food remains on it and bones and charcoal from their fires and so forth. In addition, as we look around on this, we can see little artifacts. As a matter of fact, this is full of small artifacts that came from living activity up here. All of these artifacts are rubble that came when they tore this village down in the early 19th century.
Ferguson thinks that the slave houses at Middleburg may have looked similar to the quarters on this neighboring plantation. The huts in the painting appear to have been built with mud walls and thatched roofs. In their small size and in the materials used, they closely resemble African huts, though laid out with European concern for symmetry.
Just here you can see a piece of what we call colonial ware. That's a piece of pottery that slaves made. Slaves who were living in this valley were making for their own use. There's some more examples of that pottery just over here. Here are larger pieces that we found when we were actually digging up this rubble from the last remains of the village. They were made by slaves in the tradition of West African pottery manufacture. And then we also have some pieces from some sites nearby that are larger than the ones we found in this area. This is a cooking jar. It probably was about 8 inches tall, was used in a hearth with 3 stones, and I imagine it was used for cooking sauces that were used over rice or cornmeal or whatever. In addition to that, here's a bowl, very similar to bowls made and used in West Africa, even to today. This kind of bowl was probably used for eating boiled rice or cornmeal or something like that, and people would most likely sit on the ground, on boards or on leaves, and they would use their fingers and eat rice out of this kind of bowl. Slaves here were pioneers. They were making their own pottery, and in addition to that, they were growing their food, and they were hunting and gathering things from around the creeks and the river and the woodlands and so forth. And we see evidence of that in the artifacts that we're finding. Here are some fish hooks and some fishing weights. This is a split shot weight. Another weight. A gun flint. Many people are surprised to learn that slaves had and used guns in the 18th century, but they did. And we know that they used guns as part of their work. They were often assigned, some slaves were often assigned the task of going down and shooting rice birds as they were stealing the grains of rice as the rice was growing in the summertime. And I can easily imagine they're then turning those guns on other birds and other animals and then bringing them back here and putting them in the sauce that they ate with rice as it was cooked here in the village. We're finding wild bones. These are fragments of turtle bone that were found right in this rubble pile. We found on the floor here some bones of small birds, and we'll send these bones away to have them analyzed, and we'll get a report of all of the kinds of wild animal bones that we have recovered from our excavation.
At the Charleston Museum, the food remains from Middleburg are examined by Betsy Wright. With the aid of comparative specimens, she can identify even the smallest animal from a single bone.
What we find archaeologically is that a wide variety of foods were consumed, none of which were necessarily rations. It's entirely possible that all of these foods that we find evidence of at Middleburg were in fact obtained by slaves on their own. Hence, we would not find in a documentary source in plantation records necessarily any evidence that any of these foods were consumed. They wouldn't show up in day books. They wouldn't show up in account books because the slaves were doing all of this on their own.
In addition to turtle, the small sample of bones from Middleburg revealed chicken, pork, beef, deer, catfish, quail, and possum in slaves' diets. From the evidence from other plantations, it's likely that slaves also ate frogs, squirrels, and raccoons. Not tasty, to be sure, but palatable to the hungry. The Charleston Museum possesses one other link with Africa. It's a tiny portion of a rice fanner basket, excavated from the bottom of a privy where the damp atmosphere had prevented its decay.
Slaves were involved in making a lot of the things that they used every day. Baskets were especially important on rice plantations because they used them in processing the rice in the winnowing activity when they separated the rice from the chaff. That basketry tradition carried through the 19th into the 20th century, and if you drive from Middleburg into Charleston today, you'll see ladies with stands set up beside the road where they are making and selling baskets to tourists.
One of the most skillful of today's basket makers is Henrietta Snipe.
I'm making a rice fanner, and what I'm doing now is building the sides up. As you can see, the platform is already done, and now I'm building the sides up, and it's going to be like about 8 or 9 rows up, and it's completed. And it's probably going to take for another week or so before I finish this piece. In this basket, I'm using, in the center is pine needles, and all the lighter color in here is sweetgrass. Then the darker brown is bulrush, and the wrapping is palmetto. It comes from the palm tree. It's the heart of the tree that you use. This is a family art. It's been passed down from one generation to another, and the art itself is over 300 years old.
And it's like a mother and a daughter art. It's just, you had to learn this when you're young. My mother taught me how to do it. Her mother taught her. It's just one hand generation to another. It's been handed down.
Those coiled baskets developed out of the plantation tradition here in America, and ultimately they developed out of a crafting tradition that goes all the way back to West Africa. We can look for examples of basketry from West Africa being made today, compare those with the baskets from South Carolina. They're very similar.
At Middleburg Plantation, the woods behind the main house are being cut down. The land looks much as it would have done to the slaves who cleared it for planting in the 18th century. In the woods lie the decaying remnants of a slave cemetery. The aim of Leland Ferguson's research has been to ensure that this will not be their only memorial.
I think that the important thing is to inform Americans about the true character of the history of the country, to illustrate who did important work in pioneering when the plantations were built, when the fields were cleared, when the cities were built, and so forth, so that through archaeology, which is a very democratic discipline, we're able to see the evidence of, in this case, in this valley, the majority of the people who lived and worked here, and through that illustrate or provide information about an important group of Americans that otherwise we can't learn about because there is no evidence there in the documents.
In June 1776, Thomas Jefferson drafted the American Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Ironically, at the time he wrote those words, Jefferson, depicted in this portrait with a representation of liberty, owned nearly 200 slaves. Jefferson's home at Monticello in Virginia is now a monument to the man who became the third president of the United States. Over the past 9 years, archaeological research here has revealed new clues about how Jefferson reconciled his love of liberty with his ownership of slaves. Thomas Jefferson designed Monticello himself. Starting in 1768, construction and alterations would occupy him for over 40 years. The house, built on top of a mountain, is the product of slave labor. Slaves leveled the ground to provide its base. Slaves tended the kitchen garden, 80 feet wide and 1,000 feet long. Slave field hands on the surrounding dependency farms grew tobacco, generating the wealth to finance Jefferson's designs. Today, the only tobacco which survives here is ornamental. From his study, Jefferson managed the whole estate. He was a meticulous record keeper, using the most up-to-date inventions to keep copies of his papers. In 1796, he made a precise drawing of the layout of the buildings at Monticello. On that plan, he indicated a row of houses, including his slave quarters on Mulberry Row. It was this map which showed archaeologists where to dig.
During Jefferson's time, Mulberry Row would have looked like Main Street, Monticello. It would have been a row of utilitarian outbuildings, domestic slave quarters. It would have been craft buildings and light industry. It would have had fenced-in gardens, probably between each one of the buildings, and there were some over 19 of these spaced along about a 200-yard strip. It would have been a very busy place.
On his plan, Jefferson gave every building an identifying letter and a short description. Buildings T, S, and R were servants' houses of wood with wooden chimneys and earth floors.
Along the R, S, and T sites, we've found quite a number of decorative English pearlware, the hand-painted variety being the most expensive in the ceramic line. And we also found in forms quite a number of teacups and teawares that together would make a tea set. This, I think, is very surprising to think of slaves sitting down to tea in cabins is a bit jolting. And as well, we have found quite a number of decorative-style wine glasses and even a dessert glass that was in the yard of one of the slave quarters. We found evidence of gaming pieces. For example, dominoes came from the R, S, and T site. And we have bits and pieces from musical instruments, particularly from fiddles. We have part of a fiddle bow and a fiddle neck. We found numbers of fragmented pencils, in fact, the slaves were writing, and a slate that has some words engraved on it. Now, in spite of the fact that this material would give you an impression that the slaves were very well-off material here, and it seems that they were in the realm of ceramics and glass, we still must remember that they lived in very, very small Spartan quarters, log cabins of 12 by 14 feet, and that the spaces between the logs were filled in just with plain mud. Here's a survival of a piece of what's called chinking, or the mud that filled the gaps between the logs.
Further down Mulberry Row, Kelso excavated what was to prove one of the most interesting buildings in the slave quarters, House O. Around O, Kelso found unusually high concentrations of nails and charcoal. Only a wooden chimney could have left such a footprint. Over time, the timber would have disintegrated, leaving the more durable iron behind. But when Kelso plotted the distribution of the nails on a computer program, he was surprised. The program displayed high concentrations of nails as peaks, low ones as troughs. It revealed evidence of 2 chimneys at either end of the cabin. But the nails appeared to be most concentrated away from the house. What did this mean? From old pictures, Kelso knew that some slaves had built their log cabins with leaning chimneys, supported by props. This was not a case of poor construction. It meant that if a chimney caught fire, it could be pulled down with ease, saving the main house. Kelso decided to try some experimental archaeology. He wanted to see whether a chimney fire would produce nail distributions which matched his archaeological findings from House O. In his garden, he constructed his own slave cabin, complete with leaning chimney.
There, go ahead. Keep being advised, we have the fire knocked down. I just already in 34 and 31. Calculating of it.
With the local volunteer fire brigade standing by, Kelso lit a fire in the hearth. When the blaze began to threaten the whole cabin, Kelso, like the slaves before him, removed the props. With a little assistance, the chimney was toppled, leaving the house unscathed.
broke apart. Look at that. It worked. It worked. Well, we learned a couple things. One, how stable these unstable chimneys seem to look unstable, but when we pull the props, obviously it didn't fall. And that makes sense to me, because they wouldn't build them that unstable, I don't think, because of the fact that wind would blow them over, even if they weren't on fire. So they're built to almost fall, and so we have to help them over. But they do fall, and of course, obviously, the cabin was saved, so it works. The second thing we learned, I think, that in the computer program, we see that the nails concentrate a good distance away from the house, and that the actual stack falls in a pile and it doesn't fall in a straight line. So that seemed to be what we see on the computer, and that's exactly what we're seeing there. And the third thing I think that I've learned of this is what a terrifying experience it is. I mean, it's terrifying to look at that fire and to think that all your possessions are in the house. You got to get it away, and so obviously people would come up with some way of trying to save the house, and yet use wooden chimneys.
The archaeology at Monticello has revealed how Jefferson treated his slaves. He was caught between high ideals about liberty and his need for labor. His solution to the problem was to become the model master. Slaves at Monticello enjoyed good housing and many material comforts. But Thomas Jefferson's slaves remained unfreed. Every year, over 1 million tourists visit the town of Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia for what is described as a journey into America's past. What they see is a sort of time capsule of colonial life on the eve of the American Revolution. But until recently, the picture they were offered was not the whole one. For in 1776, over half the population of this capital town were black slaves. By the 1920s, Williamsburg's colonial grandeur had faded. No longer the state capital, the town had slipped slowly into decline. But behind the 20th century shops, a national treasure lay concealed. Modern facades camouflaged original 18th century houses. It was Dr. William Goodwin, rector of the local parish church, who first dreamed of restoring Williamsburg to its colonial glory. In 1926, he approached John D. Rockefeller, Jr. for help. Rockefeller was one of the richest men in America, and with his enthusiastic involvement, a foundation was established and plans drawn up for the restoration of the town. Today, 88 original houses have been restored, and after architectural and archaeological research, a number of modern reproductions have been built on their original foundations. But Colonial Williamsburg is more than just a museum of old buildings. In numerous workshops, craftsmen in period costume now demonstrate their trades. Interpreting the history of the people who once lived here has become an important part of the Foundation's policy. Recently, special attention has been focused on one neglected section of Williamsburg's community.
What I want to do in the next 2 hours is give you as much information as I can about the black population in the colonial Chesapeake. Whenever folk ask me about...
Rex Ellis is the man in charge of the Black History program at Colonial Williamsburg. Starting from the old courthouse, he runs a special tour of the town. It's called the Other Half Tour.
Thirdly, you're missing half of history if you don't talk about half the population that was here.
I grew up in Williamsburg. I lived here all my life and never really came to the Foundation because there was supposedly nothing here for me. I knew people who worked at the Foundation as busboys and waiters and that kind of thing, but I never knew anyone who worked in the history area and never knew that there was a significant black contribution to colonial history. And the staggering amount of people that was here, for me, half the population was staggering. And I was hoping that it would give that same sort of curiosity and surprise to the people who would sign up for the tour.
Now, walk this way. Don't walk like I'm walking. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19.
I think that we are still, at least in the United States, dealing with the legacy of slavery. If not from a physical standpoint, certainly from a psychological standpoint. So hopefully my tour will in some way remove that or begin to specify it in a way that will help us understand where we all are and why we are there.
But you know what blacks are doing when they first get off the boat? Booking up, running away. Are they being successful?
No.
Why? Why aren't they being successful?
Very visible. No place to go.
They're very visible. You're right. You're right. They can't hide too well. I like that. What else?
I find many more times when I do the tour things out about the audience, not about myself, but about them, by the questions they ask, by the things they want to know. If I get a black person who says, well, tell me about the degradation. Yeah, but tell me, but it was rough, wasn't it? Didn't they castrate them and didn't they break their arms? Well, he or she is telling me something by asking me to give them that kind of information. And then there are some whites who will say, yes, but they were treated fairly well, weren't they? I mean, look at the buildings here. I mean, these buildings are better than some homes in the black ghettos now. So slavery wasn't all that bad, was it? Now, that's the other end of the spectrum, but it's just as naive a thinking process. So I think the kinds of audiences that are here are really diverse. And the kinds of people that come on the tour, well, they're part and parcel of our society. They reflect the society very well. What we're beginning to do is, and I have never known it to be done in the history of Colonial Williamsburg before, we are looking into the ground, and you're going to see it once we go to the archaeological site, but we're looking into the ground for the first time in the history of the foundation, looking for evidence of black.
The first slave site to be excavated in Williamsburg lies right in the center of town. It has proved something of a tourist attraction, and promoting his department's work is Colonial Williamsburg's Director of Archaeology, Marley Brown.
Well, what we're doing here is looking at the remains of slave quarters that dates to the second quarter of the 19th century, built about 1840. And what we're trying to do by excavating it is learn something about the material lives of slaves in Williamsburg during that period. This family that lived here, we know something about them, and the woman that lived here was the sort of head maid or nanny of the children, of the Tucker children during that period. And she lived here with her second husband, a man by the name of Jim, and they had several children. One of the advantages of doing archaeology at Colonial Williamsburg is the fact that the people that come to see us, and there are many of those during our field season, several 100,000, they're able to watch us work. People can come and actually physically observe the rather sparse and minimal remains that were associated with a slave house, and then can contrast that with the other excavations they see in progress, where we're digging the houses and the garbage of the wealthier whites. So they can see that in the process of being uncovered. But I think more importantly for them, as this result of these projects come and are provided to our interpreters, they can see the evidence of slave furnishings in the context of actual living exhibits.
Though poor, this urban slave family was probably better off than their plantation counterparts. Amongst their possessions, pieces of American stoneware, a whiteware chamber pot, a collection of buttons, a ceramic doorknob, and an English toothbrush. Poor whites may have owned similar possessions. Inside a small outbuilding near the excavations, a slave family's room has been recreated. Archaeological research provides evidence for some of the furnishings. But exhibitions like this one are controversial. Is the room too comfortable? How does one portray the living conditions of slaves? At a plantation outside the town, an attempt is being made to answer that question. In the the grounds of Carter's Grove, an entire slave quarters is being reconstructed on its original site. If it is to convey the full reality of slave life, Carter's Grove must be made as authentic as possible. One model for the reconstruction is this original 18th century slave house in southern Virginia.
There's a sizable number of slave houses that survive in the South, and actually many in Virginia, surprising numbers. But there are very few from the 18th century. This may, in fact, be the only relatively representative slave house from before the Revolution, well, before 1800, that survives in Virginia. So there's a lot we can learn from it. I suppose you could say we're involved in something that might be called architectural archaeology.
Okay, it's 9.6½.
Okay, how about here? This is an archaeologist working in the ground, would measure every detail and plot it on first on an unfinished plan and then ultimately on a measured plan of the site. We'll show every stud and rafter and brace and piece all of that together into a portrait that ultimately, hopefully, illustrates how the house changed and how it grew and was altered. You think this is original, or do you think? We're looking at details, but we're also looking at, in a broader sense, at what the quality of life was like here. What was the level of accommodation provided by the house? Well, I suppose people lived up here, although not very exciting. Is it? You can see that it's pretty heavily smoke flagging. It must have been pretty smoky, as well as cold in the winter and warm in the summer. There's a window, but it's not glazed, is it? It's still into the 20th century. It had a wooden shutter.
Still must have been pretty breezy with the holes inside.
Right.
Kind of miserable with the bugs flying around.
Right. You couldn't stand up in here, which I suppose is a major factor when one considers level of comfort. All things considered, it's a pretty mean space, despite the fact that this is probably one of the best slave houses there was in late colonial Virginia.
At Carter's Grove, Ed Chappell's designs for the slave quarters are based on a whole range of original slave cabins. Not only do the buildings look authentic, they are constructed using 18th century methods and tools. But it's not just the way the buildings look that's important. Carter's Grove must portray the harshness of slavery without alienating the visitors who come to Colonial Williamsburg.
Most of what went on at Carter's Grove was pure and simple work, hard work, done by blacks who did not have any opportunity for freedom, any opportunity for running away, any opportunity for doing anything but that 10 to 15 hour a day grind. Well, if I were a black coming to Williamsburg or going somewhere to try to find out about the black experience, and all I was afforded was, this is how blacks were emasculated and emaciated and humiliated, I don't know that I would travel here.
Explaining the painful realities of slave life to both black and white visitors is a sensitive task. When construction work ends, Rex Ellis and his colleagues will lead the other half tour to Carter's Grove. The skill with which they interpret the site to visiting tourists will determine the real success of the Black History program at Colonial Williamsburg.
Our challenge is to find things that in some way give blacks as well as whites the understanding that the survival techniques that these blacks created in order to withstand and overcome this whole slavery institution began in this slave quarter.
Hold on, just a little while longer. Hold on, just a little while longer.
look at the artifacts, the structural remains, you realize the slaves were people that had very everyday lives, that lived, worked, cooked. And so you get just a sense that they were people like everyone else, and that there's, and while it's true they were under conditions we could never appreciate, that part of their lives were like everyone else's lives. And so this is why I think that the archaeology in particular has allowed the public to change their attitudes towards slavery.
I think that there is a coming of age of America where we are realizing that slavery is a part of the American experience. And those are the people who are coming, and those are the people that make it exciting for me to talk about this.